Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then is he impotent? Is he able but not willing? Then is he malevolent? Is he both able and willing? Whence then this evil? And many of my colleagues at Oxford will say to me quietly, please don't talk to me about a personal God. How can there be a God when this world is in such a mess? How can there be a God when my world is in such a mess?
If you are personally suffering or struggling with the idea of a good and loving God in the face of evil and suffering, then I urge you to watch this video to the end, because John Lennox tackles this question from two different angles that I think are both extremely important. One other disclaimer, I will give my commentary on the end of this video, and if that sounds somewhat familiar, that's because we kind of had to do a take 2 of this video due to a glitch that we had yesterday on the channel. With that being said, let's dive in.
And I couldn't help thinking of Richard Dawkins when he talks about the ultimate nature of reality in this direction. And when he says this universe is just as you would expect it to be. In a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it or any justice. The universe we observe, writes Dawkins, has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at the bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is. And we dance to its music. I've mentioned that to Richard Dawkins publicly several times. He's never retracted it. And ladies and gentlemen, we need to face this analysis, because it is increasingly prevalent in the academy. Listen carefully to what it says. There is no good, there is no evil. But half a minute. Do I hear Richard Dawkins complaining that God is evil? I do. But if there's no good and no evil, that is a meaningless statement. Now, this is enormously important. I know it's theoretical, but it is important. The logical consequence of Dawkins' attitude is to abolish the categories of good and evil. But if you do that, ladies and gentlemen, it's idle to talk about God being evil or the world being evil, because there isn't any good or evil. Now, the reason, of course, that Dawkins still talks about evil is that he discovers, as you and I discover, all of us, that we are moral beings, whether we believe in God or not. We've got a sensitivity to right and wrong, to good and bad, to justice and injustice, and therefore, whether we are an atheist or not, we look at Auschwitz and we say it's evil. Yes? But that's beginning to make a hole in naturalism. Because if the logical consequence of believing there is no God is to abolish the categories of good and evil, then the logical consequence of admitting that these categories exist is to reintroduce the possibility that there is a God, with all the problems that that brings with it. We've had some awful shootings in recent days. If the shooters were just dancing to the music of their DNA, can you blame them? Of course not. 9/11. Just dancing to the music of their DNA, were they? How could you possibly blame them? We know in our hearts that that cannot be true. Charles Taylor, in his brilliant book, The Secular Age, writes this: the modern age, more or less repudiating the idea of a divine lawgiver, has nevertheless tried to retain the ideas of moral right and wrong, not noticing that in casting God aside, they have also abolished the conditions of meaningfulness for moral right and wrong as well. And that is a supreme irony to my mind. And so, although atheism seems immediately to offer a solution, this is just how it is, it's brute fact, we have to accept it. Actually, it doesn't offer a solution at all. It makes the situation even more difficult. And Richard Dawkins said to me once, yes, the picture I paint is bleak, but that doesn't mean it's false. I said, Richard, it doesn't mean it's true either. We've got to investigate the evidence, ladies and gentlemen, as we find our way into this very difficult problem. According to the Christian worldview, there is to be a final judgment. That's a big thing to say in contemporary society, isn't it? It's an even bigger thing to claim that the final judge has already been appointed. His name is Yeshua, Jesus Christ. You say you don't seriously believe that as an Oxford professor. Yes, I do. I don't know what the Oxford professor has got to do with it. And I'm not the only one. Ladies and gentlemen, whatever you make of it, one of the most marvelous things, it seems to me, is the concept that there will be a judgment. Because it means that our conscience that tells us about right and wrong is not ultimately an illusion. People do not like these days to talk about judgment because they haven't really thought about it. The Christian claim, ladies and gentlemen, is this: ultimately, this world is going to be judged totally fairly, and justice will be done. Do you know what that does for me? It gives me something that atheism by definition cannot give me, and that's hope. By banishing God from the equation, you have by definition banished all hope. Couldn't God have made beings that didn't sin, that didn't destroy each other? My answer may shock you. Of course he could. Of course he could. We make them, you know, in laboratories. We call them robots. Of course you can make beings that are non-moral. If you're going to have the capacity to say yes, you must have the capacity to say no. And you say, well, why did God do that? Why do you have children? Never forget holding my first child in my arms and realizing that I have brought this little girl into the world. She could grow up to say no to me. Why take the risk? Do you ever think about it? Why do we do it, ladies and gentlemen? Because we realize that granted the risk, the benefits outweigh the risk. To live in a world where love is possible, we all crave for a world in which love is actualized. And you hope one day, maybe you've already got there, you students at Rice, that you'll meet somebody and fall in love with them, and they'll fall in love with you, and they'll value you, and they'll choose you. And the value of that, and you know that it's got an inherent risk. God took a risk to make a universe with people in it, made in his image, capable of choosing, capable of saying yes to God, and equally capable of saying no. Moral beings. So granted that it's like that, there's another question we can ask, and that is this. Granted that there's a risk, did God make any provision if things went wrong? Now here, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to speak to you frankly as a Christian, because Other religions must defend their own reactions to this. We started by talking about the problem of suffering. And now I want to tell you about a God who suffered. That conversation with my Jewish friends didn't finish where I mentioned. I said to them, you know, I want to say something to you that's going to be very difficult. They said, that's okay. I said, you've gathered by now that I believe that Yeshua is HaMashiach, Jesus is the Messiah. Yes, they said. I said, I believe something even more that's going to be, well, very difficult for you. He said, go on, tell me, what is it you believe? I said, I believe he's God incarnate. He was God. Now I said, you know he was crucified. Yes. I said, try and come with me just for a moment. I know it's going to be very difficult, but try and come with me. If that is God on a cross, what is it telling you? I said, at the very least, it's telling you this. It's telling you that God has not remained distant from the problem of human suffering, but has become part of it. And I'll never forget his answer. He says, why has no one ever told me that before? Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is a very deep thing. I've made a dozen massive claims that go against the grain of the naturalism and the academy of the 21st century. But the longer I live and the more I study these things, the more I find them making sense after sense. And not solving the problem, but giving me a way in. You say, why would you believe that story? You, a scientist, why would you believe that story? Well, I believe it, ladies and gentlemen, because Jesus gave evidence of being God incarnate by rising from the dead. And I say that, I believe that as a scientist there is evidence for it. In my most recent book, Gunning for God, I spend a couple of chapters going through this, through the eyes of the skeptic David Hume, in order to try and get across the idea that there is evidence that Jesus rose from the dead, therefore death is not the end. And that opens up a whole world of possibilities that atheism knows nothing about.
We look